The sound of a designer heel grinding a smartphone into glass dust echoed through the marble halls of the Kwon estate. The maid at Isabella's feet didn't sob. She didn't even dare to flinch. In this house, humiliation wasn't just a habit, it was the law. Every servant knew the unspoken hierarchy of the Shadow King, Kwon Sang-woo. But it was his fiancée, Isabella Amber, who held the whip. She was the reason the staff worked with their heads permanently bowed, the reason the most hardened guards looked at the floor when she passed. She mistook their silence for loyalty and her cruelty for power. But the atmosphere shifted the second a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. Kwon Eun-ji had returned. She didn't arrive with a scream or a threat. She stepped into the hall with a serene, slight smile and eyes that held the weight of a judge. As Isabella's voice rose in a familiar, snarling mid-scream, Eun-ji didn't look away. She didn't bow. And most importantly, she wasn't afraid. Eun-ji wasn't just a daughter returning home. She was an observer who had been watching from the shadows. And in her hand, she held a smartphone with a screen that would change everything. The tires of the sleek black sedan crunched over the gravel of the Kwon estate, a sound that usually signaled the return of the master, but today it felt like a haunting. Kwon Eun-ji stepped out into the humid morning air, her eyes tracing the familiar, cold limestone of the mansion. It had been years since she walked these halls, yet the house seemed to shrink at her presence, sensing a ghost that had finally decided to take on flesh. As she entered the foyer, the atmosphere didn't just chill, it curdled. The staff, once her playmates and protectors, now moved like clockwork dolls, their eyes glued to the floorboards as if looking up might invite a death sentence. Standing at the top of the grand staircase was Isabella Amber, draped in emerald silk that looked more like armor than evening wear. She didn't offer a welcome, she offered a boundary. "The West Wing is off limits," Isabella called down, her voice a sharp, polished blade that cut through the stagnant air. "It has been repurposed for my private quarters. You'll find a modest guest suite in the North Gallery. Do not stray beyond it. Consider that a calculated warning, Eun-ji. This house has new rules, and I am the one who writes them." Eun-ji didn't stop her stride. She didn't look up to acknowledge the woman standing above her, nor did she falter at the mention of restricted access. Instead, she headed straight for the West Wing, her heels clicking a rhythmic defiance against the marble. The guards at the corridor entrance shifted, their hands twitching toward their holsters, caught in the impossible friction between the woman they feared and the daughter they once loved. "Did you hear me?" Isabella snarled, her composure beginning to fray at the edges like a cheap tapestry. "That area is restricted." Eun-ji paused only when her hand touched the heavy oak handle of the West Wing doors. She turned her head just enough to catch Isabella's reflection in a nearby gilded mirror. A serene, slight smile touched Eun-ji's lips. The kind of smile that suggested she wasn't just ignoring the rules, she was erasing them. "My father built this wing for my mother," Eun-ji said, her voice a low, steady hum that carried further than Isabella's scream ever could. "Every brick remembers her. Every shadow here knows my name. You may have changed the locks, Isabella, but you can't change the heritage." Without waiting for a response, Eun-ji pushed the doors open. The restricted barrier didn't just break, it vanished. As she stepped into the forbidden territory, she could feel Isabella's fury burning into her back, but Eun-ji didn't look back. She was no longer a guest in her father's house. She was the inevitable tide, and the shore was already starting to crumble. The dining hall of the Kwon estate was a cavern of silent, expensive tension. At the head of the long mahogany table, Kwon Sang-woo sat like a statue, his presence heavy enough to dampen the sound of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. To his right, Isabella Amber was a vision of sharp, practiced elegance in a dress the color of a fresh bruise. She watched the servants move with a predatory focus, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, irritating beat against the crystal stem of her glass. When Eun-ji entered, she didn't rush. She walked with a measured gait, her posture a silent refusal to acknowledge the suffocating weight of the room's atmosphere. She took her seat opposite Isabella, her expression a mask of serene, slight triumph. Isabella's tapping stopped. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Eun-ji, then at the empty wine decanter near the center of the table. "The staff is slow tonight," Isabella said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade that cut through the silence. She didn't look at the butler, she looked directly at Eun-ji. "Eun-ji, darling, be a sweetheart and pour the wine. You're already closer to it than the help." The air in the room seemed to vanish. A young maid near the sideboard gripped her tray so hard her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting to the floor in practiced terror. It was a blatant move, a test designed to force a bow or ignite a scene. Eun-ji didn't flinch. She didn't even look annoyed. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes tracing the line of Isabella's rigid shoulders and the subtle tremor in her manicured hand. To Eun-ji, this wasn't an order. It was a data point in a behavioral assessment. "It's fascinating," Eun-ji said softly, her voice carrying a clinical, terrifyingly calm weight. "The way you correlate personal service with dominance. It suggests a profound insecurity about your own standing in this house." Isabella's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "I asked you for wine, not a lecture." "And I am observing the intent behind the request," Eun-ji replied, her gaze steady and unflinching. She didn't reach for the decanter. Instead, she looked at her father, who remained a silent, observant son. "If you require a servant, Isabella, look to the professionals. If you require my attention, try a different tactic. This one is beneath the standard of this household." The silence that followed was physical, a pressure cooker moment that threatened to shatter like porcelain. Isabella's mouth opened mid-snarl, her composure cracking under the weight of a girl who refused to play the victim. Eun-ji simply picked up her napkin, her smile remaining perfectly, triumphantly intact. Eun-ji moved through the sprawling mansion not as a resident, but as a ghost haunting the corners of Isabella's carefully constructed stage. While Isabella focused her energy on loud displays of dominance, Eun-ji practiced the art of the clinical gaze. She spent her mornings in the high-traffic corridors, her presence so still and unassuming that the estate's security detail eventually stopped tensing when she approached. It was during these long hours of observation that Eun-ji began to see the tremors beneath the ice. She noticed how Isabella's hand tightened on her silk skirts whenever Sang-woo's senior lieutenants entered the room, and how her sharp, rhythmic heel clicks faltered for a fraction of a second if she wasn't being directly looked at. Isabella wasn't powerful. She was performing. She was a woman who mistook the staff's terror for her own strength, never realizing that fear is a brittle foundation. The guards were the first to feel the shift in the house's gravity. One afternoon, near the reinforced doors of the security wing, Eun-ji paused beside a young guard named Min-ho. He stood rigid, his eyes fixed forward, yet Eun-ji saw the slight wince in his posture from a standing shift that had gone on too long under Isabella's reactive scheduling. Without a word, she set a small glass bottle of water on the ledge beside him and adjusted a nearby floral arrangement so it partially obscured his position from the main security cameras. "She counts the seconds, but she doesn't see the hours," Eun-ji murmured, her voice a calm ripple in the oppressive silence. She didn't wait for a thank you. She didn't need one. She saw the guard's throat move as he swallowed, a minute break in his armor. Later, as she passed the barracks, she overheard a veteran guard whispering to a recruit. They weren't talking about Isabella's latest outburst or the threat of dismissal. They were talking about the girl who walked like she belonged and looked at the world without flinching. Eun-ji realized then that silence wasn't just a shield, it was a magnifying glass. By refusing to join the theater of fear, she was forcing everyone else to see the cracks in the lead actress. Isabella Amber was losing her grip, not because of a grand rebellion, but because a single pair of eyes refused to see her as a queen. Eun-ji smiled, her slight, triumphant smile, her thumb tracing the edge of the smartphone in her pocket. The containment had begun. The atmosphere in the Kwon mansion had curdled into something thick and sour, a direct reflection of Isabella's mounting desperation. Eun-ji could feel the eyes of the staff darting away as she moved through the corridors, the silence now carrying a jagged edge of anticipation. She had just returned from the garden when she found her bedroom door slightly ajar, a small, careless mistake that Isabella would never have made a week ago. Inside, the room had been disturbed with a violent kind of thoroughness. Silk scarves were tossed across the duvet like shed skins, and her vanity drawers hung open like gasping mouths. Resting conspicuously atop her pillow was a heavy platinum necklace, encrusted with diamonds that caught the afternoon sun with a cold, mocking glint. It was Isabella's favorite piece, the one she claimed had been a gift from Sang-woo to seal their undying devotion. Eun-ji didn't touch it. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe and waited. Her expression settled into that same serene, slight smile that drove Isabella to the brink of a snarl. The confrontation arrived with the rhythmic, aggressive click of heels. Isabella burst into the room, flanked by two of Sang-woo's most senior guards, her face a mask of practiced outrage. "I knew you were resentful, Eun-ji, but I didn't think you were a common thief," Isabella hissed, her voice rising to ensure the eavesdropping staff in the hall heard every syllable. She pointed a trembling finger at the pillow. "Search the rest of her things. Who knows what else she's tucked away while playing the virtuous daughter?" Sang-woo appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed in a mix of absolute shock and disappointment as he looked from the jewelry to his daughter. The stakes were clear. In his world, a thief was a liability, and a daughter who stole from the family was a ghost. "Is that your final accusation, Isabella?" Eun-ji asked, her voice so quiet it forced everyone to lean in. "The evidence is right there!" Isabella screamed, her composure finally snapping into the aggressive, etched wrinkles of a woman losing her grip. Eun-ji slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She didn't look at the necklace. She looked directly at her father. "Perspective is a funny thing," she murmured. With a calm thumb swipe, she turned the screen toward the room. The video was grainier than the cinematic reality of the room, but the timestamp was unmistakable. It showed Isabella herself, 15 minutes prior, slipping into the room with the necklace clutched in her palm and a frantic, predatory look in her eyes. The screen flickered with the cool-toned glow of the truth. "I know everything." The silence that followed was physical, a pressure cooker finally reaching its limit. Isabella's face drained of color as she realized she hadn't just failed to frame Eun-ji, she had documented her own obsolescence. Eun-ji tucked the phone away, her triumph silent and absolute, leaving her father to stare at his fiancée as if seeing a stranger for the very first time. The silence in Sang-woo's study was heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cedar and the ghost of a conflict that hadn't yet found its voice. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain blur the jagged skyline of the city he supposedly ruled. Behind him, the door clicked shut. He didn't need to turn to know it was Eun-ji. Her presence didn't demand attention like a shattering teacup. It settled into the room like a steady, inescapable light. "She wants you gone, Eun-ji," Sang-woo said, his voice a low grate of gravel. He was the Shadow King, a man whose name made rivals tremble. Yet in the high contrast shadows of his own office, he looked comically tired, his eyes wide with a flicker of the same shock he felt when the household order began to fray. Eun-ji crossed the room with that same triumphant serenity that had begun to unnerve the entire estate. She didn't stop a respectful distance away. She walked right to the edge of his desk, forcing him to face her. "She doesn't want me gone, Father. She wants the fear back. She wants everyone to look at the floor again when she walks by." Sang-woo's jaw tightened. He thought of Isabella, her snarling outbursts, the way she mistook his silence for permission to break the people around them. He had allowed it because it was convenient, a wall of terror that kept the world at bay. But looking at Eun-ji, he saw a different kind of power. She wasn't an obedient planet revolving around his son. She was a mirror showing him how much of his own empire he had surrendered to a woman's insecurity. "She says you're insolent, that you're dismantling the respect I've built," Sang-woo murmured, though the conviction was missing from his tone. "Respect isn't built on glass shards and bruised skin," Eun-ji replied, her green eyes piercing and calm. She reached into her pocket, the modern, dark-framed smartphone catching the dim light. She didn't show him the screen yet, but the way she held it, as a key rather than a weapon, made the air in the room turn cold. You're caught between a woman who needs you to be a monster so she can feel like a queen, and a daughter who just wants you to be the leader you actually are." Sungwoo looked at his daughter, then back at the door where Isabella's influence lurked like a physical weight. For the first time in years, the Shadow King felt the pressure cooker of his own home reaching a breaking point. He was a man who lived by control, but as he stood between Isabella's reactive terror and Eun-ji's clinical clarity, he realized he was the only one in the room who was truly afraid. The following morning, the West Wing of the Kwon estate was transformed into a theater of calculated cruelty. Isabella had invited a group of high society associates, women with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, to witness what she called a necessary correction in household standards. As the guests sipped vintage champagne, Isabella's voice rang out, cold and cutting, as she pointed toward the marble floor. "The grout in this wing has been neglected. It requires hand polishing. Eun-ji, since you claim to be so observant of this house, I'm sure you won't mind showing our guests how a daughter of the Kwon family handles real labor." A heavy silence fell over the room. The guests exchanged looks of uncomfortable amusement, while the regular staff lowered their heads, unable to watch the boss's daughter be treated like a common laborer. But Eun-ji didn't flinch. She stepped forward with a serene, slight smile that seemed to radiate a calm triumph, making Isabella's aggressive posture look desperate by comparison. Without a word of protest, Eun-ji knelt. She didn't drop to her knees in a display of broken spirit. She lowered herself with the poise of an athlete or a queen, her movements rhythmic and controlled. As she began to scrub, the guests began to murmur, but the tone had shifted. They weren't laughing at her, they were watching her. Eun-ji performed the demeaning task with such methodical grace that it ceased to be a punishment and became a performance of absolute self-possession. Isabella paced above her, her heels clicking sharply against the stone like a ticking clock. "Faster," she hissed, leaning down until she was inches from Eun-ji's face. "Let's see if that pride of yours can handle the dirt." Eun-ji paused, her hazel eyes meeting Isabella's snarling expression with a level of clarity that made the older woman recoil. "Pride isn't found in the task, Isabella," Eun-ji said, her voice quiet enough only for the two of them to hear. "It's found in the person who remains unchanged by it." By the time the guests began to filter out toward the garden, the atmosphere in the West Wing had reached a pressure cooker intensity. Isabella's face was flushed with a reactive rage, her nails digging into her palms as she realized that her attempt to humiliate her stepdaughter had only highlighted her own insecurity. Eun-ji stood up, smoothing her dark top, her posture as straight and unbothered as the moment she had arrived. She hadn't been broken. She had simply observed another crack in Isabella's failing armor. The atmosphere in the grand dining hall was thick enough to choke the life out of a room. Isabella Amber stood at the head of the table, her face no longer the mask of a polished socialite, but a snarling portrait of fractured control. Her breathing was shallow and jagged, a sharp contrast to Kwon Eun-ji, who stood opposite her with the stillness of a deep, undisturbed lake. The provocation had been small, a question Eun-ji had answered with a level of calm that Isabella mistook for an open declaration of war. To Isabella, every breath Eun-ji took without permission was an act of treason. She looked at the girl and didn't see a stepdaughter. She saw a mirror reflecting her own profound insecurity. "You think you're untouchable because of whose blood runs in your veins?" Isabella hissed, her voice vibrating with a lethal, unhinged energy. "In this house, I am the only pulse that matters. You are nothing but a ghost I haven't bothered to exorcise yet." Eun-ji didn't blink. She didn't even move her hands from where they were clasped loosely at her sides. She simply watched, her piercing hazel eyes tracking the frantic movement of Isabella's pupils. "If you were truly the heart of this house, Isabella," Eun-ji said, her voice a quiet, terrifying melodic hum, "you wouldn't have to keep reminding us that you're beating." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a fuse that had finally reached the powder. Isabella's composure didn't just crack, it shattered. With a guttural sound that was more animal than human, her hand shot out. The slap cracked through the hall like a gunshot, the violence of it so sudden and visceral that a maid at the sideboard let out a muffled cry. Eun-ji's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. Her hair fell over her face, obscuring her expression for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Isabella stood there, chest heaving, her palms stinging and red, waiting for the tears. She was waiting for Eun-ji to crumble, to beg, to finally show the fear that Isabella needed to feel whole. But the tears never came. Slowly, with a terrifying, rhythmic deliberation, Eun-ji turned her head back to face her. A small trail of blood traced a path from the corner of her mouth, yet the serene, slight smile remained perfectly intact. If anything, it had grown sharper. She didn't reach up to touch her bruised cheek. She didn't acknowledge the pain. Instead, she looked past Isabella to where Kwon Sang-woo stood in the arched doorway, his face a mask of absolute, watery-eyed shock. "Now," Eun-ji whispered, her voice steady and triumphant. "Everyone sees you exactly as you are." Isabella recoiled, as if she had been the one struck. She looked at her trembling hand, then at the horrified faces of the staff who were no longer looking at the floor, but at the monster she had become. The physical crack had been Isabella's final play for dominance, but as Eun-ji stood there, unbowed and glowing with a quiet victory, it was clear that Isabella was the only one who had truly been broken. The heavy oak doors of the study clicked shut, sealing out the frantic whispers of the mansion. Kwon Sang-woo stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the city lights, while Isabella paced the rug like a caged predator. Her face was still flushed, her breathing jagged from the mid-hallway scream that had finally shattered her mask of composure. "She has to go, Sang-woo," Isabella hissed, her hand trembling as she pointed toward the door. "Your daughter is a cancer in this house. She's turned the staff against me. She's turning you against me." Eun-ji stood in the center of the room, an island of stillness in the middle of Isabella's storm. She didn't argue. She didn't defend her character. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. The cool blue glow of the screen illuminated her serene expression, a sharp contrast to the chaotic shadows dancing on the walls. "I didn't turn anyone, Isabella," Eun-ji said, her voice a calm, clinical thread of sound. "I simply watched the bridges you were already burning." Sang-woo turned, his eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and rising suspicion. He had spent months ignoring the cracks, choosing the comfort of Isabella's curated terror over the messy truth of his crumbling reputation. Eun-ji stepped forward, extending the phone toward her father. On the screen, the header text was bold and unforgiving. "I know everything." As Sang-woo scrolled, his face drained of color, replaced by a comical, exaggerated mask of shock. It wasn't just a recording of a tantrum, it was a digital ledger of Isabella's true work. There were encrypted threads where she had leaked details of Sang-woo's private health to rival syndicates to weaken his standing. There were voice memos of her laughing about how easily his Mafia legacy could be dismantled by a few well-placed rumors of instability. "She's attacking your image from the inside, father," Eun-ji whispered, her green eyes piercing and triumphant. "She didn't want to be your queen. She wanted to be your successor, built on the bones of the fear she sowed in your name." Isabella lunged for the device, her face twisting into an aggressive snarl, her mouth open in a desperate, silent mid-scream. But Eun-ji didn't flinch. She simply held the phone higher, the light casting a rim of certainty around her features. The Shadow King looked at the woman he had intended to marry and realized he didn't recognize her at all. The smartphone had stripped away the silk and the status, leaving only the reactive, snarling reality of a woman who had mistaken proximity to power for the power itself. The silence that followed wasn't the usual silence of fear. It was the heavy, final silence of clarity. Isabella Amber's scream was not a human sound. It was the high-pitched, metallic screech of a mechanism finally snapping under too much pressure. Her face, usually a mask of expensive serums and calculated poise, twisted into a map of aggressive wrinkles and raw, snarling fury. She lunged forward, her hand thrust aggressively toward the smartphone Eun-ji held, but Sang-woo moved faster. For months, Kwon Sang-woo had lived in the comfort of a curated lie, mistaking Isabella's volatile cruelty for the kind of fire a man in his position needed by his side. But as he looked at the screen Eun-ji presented, the cool, blue-gray glow illuminating the undeniable evidence of Isabella's betrayals, the fog finally cleared. He didn't just see a jealous fiancé, he saw the monster he had invited into the very heart of his empire. "I gave you everything!" Isabella shrieked, her mouth agape in a mid-scream that revealed the jagged desperation beneath her vanity. "I protected your name! I made them fear you!" "You made them fear you," Sang-woo corrected, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet vibration that made the water beads on his forehead shimmer under the high-contrast lighting. He stood behind Eun-ji, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and a dawning, comical realization of his own blindness. He realized that while he was busy ruling the city, Isabella had been dismantling the loyalty of his own house, brick by brick, through a regime of senseless humiliation. Eun-ji remained the eye of the storm. She didn't flinch as Isabella's knuckles whitened with rage, nor did she recoil from the fiery glow of the woman's hatred. Instead, she maintained her serene, slight smile, her hazel eyes fixed on the camera as if she were documenting the exact moment the hierarchy collapsed. She held the phone like a key, the words, "I know everything," serving as the final nail in Isabella's coffin. Isabella looked from the phone to Sang-woo's hardened expression and back to Eun-ji's triumphant calm. The realization that her leverage was gone hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, the aggressive energy leaving her body as she realized that the quiet daughter she had tried to break was the one who had finally broken her. The mansion, once loud with her demands, felt suddenly, hauntingly still. Sang-woo didn't need to say the words. The finality in his gaze told the story. The masquerade was over, and the monster was finally being unmasked in the light of the truth. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall didn't slam. They closed with a muted, mechanical click that sounded more like a verdict than a departure. Isabella Amber did not go out with the fiery defiance she had promised. Instead, as the security team stepped forward, their faces finally free of the mask of terror, she seemed to shrink. The cream silk of her dress, once a symbol of her untouchable status, now looked like a shroud. She looked toward Sang-woo one last time, her mouth opening to let out a final, jagged plea or a curse. But the words died in her throat. His gaze remained fixed on the smartphone Eun-ji still held, his face a landscape of absolute, quiet shock. Without a single word being exchanged, Isabella was led across the marble floor she had once stained with broken porcelain and blood, her heels clicking a frantic, hollow rhythm until the sound faded into the distance. Then, the mansion did something it hadn't done in years. It exhaled. The suffocating tension that had clung to the velvet curtains and chilled the air in every corridor simply evaporated. In the kitchen, a tray was set down without the clatter of trembling hands. In the gardens, the guards shifted their weight, no longer looking over their shoulders for a woman who sought power in their fear. It was a physical change, a sudden warmth returning to a fortress that had been frozen in a perpetual winter. Eun-ji lowered the phone, the cool glow of the "I know everything" screen finally dimming. She didn't gloat. She didn't rush to her father's side to claim the space Isabella had vacated. She simply stood there, her expression retaining that same triumphant serenity that had served as her armor. She watched her father, Kwon Sang-woo, as he finally looked up. The man who ruled an empire through iron and blood looked at his daughter and saw, perhaps for the first time, that the strength he had been searching for in others had been right in front of him, forged in the very silence he had ignored. "It's over," Eun-ji said softly, her voice carrying none of the sharp edges Isabella had used to cut down the staff. "The house is yours again, father. Try to rule it with something better than fear this time." She didn't wait for his answer. Just as she had arrived, Eun-ji walked toward the stairs, her posture straight and her spirit unbroken. She wasn't staying to take the throne. She had come to clear the rot. As she ascended, she passed Mrs. Calloway, who stood near the banister with tears of relief pricking her eyes. Eun-ji offered her a small, genuine nod, a silent acknowledgement of a shared survival. The shadow had lifted, the exile was complete, and for the first time in a generation, the Kwon estate was at peace. Real power isn't found in the person who screams the loudest or humiliates the most. It belongs to the one who arrives without fear and leaves without regret. Eun-ji showed us that rules based on fear don't last, and respect lasts. If this story reminded you that your value isn't decided by those who try to break you, let us know. Like this video to stand with Eun-ji. Comment "unbroken" if you believe silence is strength. Subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a chapter of these powerful emotional journeys. Share this with someone who needs the courage to look their demons in the eye. Thank you for watching.